We humans crave certainty and abhor misery. As a result, we invest our love, our faith, our treasure into institutions designed to instill a sense of clarity and to yield hope. Many people place this devotion into a religion, a faith community, a house of worship. But in my case, I fell in love with the theater first. When I was in elementary school, I played the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. That's a picture of me in a costume my mother made for me. My two best friends played the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. It was a transformative experience. From that moment on, I intuitively knew that for the rest of my life, I wanted the theater to be a vital part of it. And so it has been. About 4 years after that picture was taken, maybe 5, I decided to devote myself to another institution. I had atheistic tendencies, but a number of my family and friends were trying on this thing called Christianity. So after some skepticism, I tried it on too. And to my surprise, I realized that it fit and that I wanted to be part of it. Interestingly, an experience with the theater aided with this transformation. When I was about 16, I saw a wonderful production of Samuel Beckett's absurdist masterpiece, Waiting for Godot. I remember many things from that amazing production. I remember how funny it was. Absurdism can be really funny. I remember how great the acting was. And I do remember the bleak existential message of the play, essentially professing that life is meaningless and that we are all here alone. You might think that that bleak existential message might push me away from my young faith. However, strangely, it had the opposite effect. I remember feeling grateful. I remember thinking, if I didn't have this new thing called Christianity in my life, I might end up like those two tramps on the side of the road. It seemed to me that their life was a hopeless end. And it also seemed that this new thing that I had found was an endless hope. The title of my presentation today is called On Behalf of the Art of Doubt and Lament. Doubt and lament are two topics that make people very nervous. So with that discomfort in mind, I propose the following thesis. A willingness to open oneself to art that authentically expresses doubt and lament reflects a healthy cultural posture and an intellectually mature faith. To be more inclusive, we can define faith simply as an institution, a deity, something that you put your trust in. My first main point centers on the possible virtues of being honest about our doubts. Christians often fear doubt and see it as some kind of character flaw. Indeed, in a collection of essays entitled The Joyful Christian, none other than C.S. Lewis pinpoints a common belief among Christians, albeit mistaken in his opinion, that expressions of doubt represent some kind of weak faith or a lack of virtue. For communities of faith, perhaps this fear of doubt is understandable. It seems that everyone around here has recently been quoting this Pew Research study about nones. Nones, if you're not familiar, are people who don't identify with any religious affiliation. The study finds that about 31% of Generation Z, the single largest category in the study, now identify as nones. But should the response to a statistical trend stop us from asking difficult questions? In the spirit of the truth will set us free, I would argue that people of faith, and all people for that matter, should actively pursue the truth and strive to live within it. In my area of Christianity, there's an important document called the Belgic Confession. It's very important in Reformed theology. It's a theological treatise. And it argues essentially that human beings learn about their God in one of two ways. I am sure you can predict the most primary way, that we learn about God through Holy Scripture, through God's divine word. But the second way that the Belgic Confession says that we learn about God is more interesting to me. It argues that we learn about God by studying the natural world. To quote, which is before our eyes the most elegant book, leading us to contemplate the invisible intricacies of God. In their provocatively titled book, Jesus Loves You and Evolution is True, my esteemed and brave colleagues at Northwestern College, Dr. Sarah Tolsma, a biologist, and Dr. Jason Leaf, a practical theologian focusing on youth ministry, argue that in the long term, the church's refusal to reconcile the science of evolution, to integrate it with Christianity, may be contributing to an exodus of young people from the church. Ironically, perhaps these nones are leaving the church because the church is often unwilling to entertain doubt. If the church is lying to me about the age of the earth, what else are they lying about? Thankfully, as a theater professor, my expertise rests not in untangling the scientific arguments about the nature and duration of the creation of the earth or the formation of life as we know it. Rather, my pedagogical passion professes the power of story, particularly story's ability to ask necessary, if difficult, questions. If a philosopher or a theologian's job is to answer life's difficult question, perhaps an artist's job is to simply ask them. Art clearly is powerful. We all know this. Just ask any dictator. The first thing that a totalitarian oppressor does when they achieve power is censor the artists. This was true in the theaters of Moscow in the 1920s. It's true in the art galleries of Berlin of the 1930s. And sadly, to a certain degree, it's true of the school libraries of Florida in the 2020s. I could be wrong, but I don't think it's wise for Christians or any other group to align themselves with the practices of totalitarian oppressors. And such a censorship also begs the question, how weak is a belief, an ideology, a faith, if it cannot survive being contradicted by an artistic representation? Or, as the poet laureate Bob Dylan said, how weak is the foundation that you're standing upon? On our individual journeys, we all must eventually decide if we want to make the faith of our mothers and our fathers our own. As we do this, I believe it's safer to experience doubt vicariously through the various beauties of art, through paintings, poems, requiems, and plays. I readily admit that exposing ourselves to doubt can be painful and fraught. If possible, I recommend tasting these profound expressions of doubt within the context of what the sociologist Parker Palmer calls a clearness committee, a group of friends and colleagues, loved ones, who trust and love each other and who genuinely want the best for one another. Driven by sincere feelings of anger, sadness, disbelief, and alienation, lament, the sister of doubt, often finds expression through art. This is an artwork by the sculptor Albert Gheorghi, and it's a visual representation of grief. I find it very moving and beautiful. In Movies as Prayers, film spotting critic Josh Larson lists an entire genre of films that he considers prayers of laments. These films include a wide range of texts, from 12 Years a Slave, to Requiem for a Dream, to Chinatown, to The Dark Knight. Imagine that prayer vigil movie marathon. Again, many of us are skittish about engaging in lament. Perhaps this is because of self-help mentalities that tells us that we need to cure or squelch our sad feelings in order to properly function. In communities of faith, I think there are many people who legitimately fear expressing anger toward a deity because it might somehow be dangerous or lack gratitude. Such anti-lament positions, in my opinion, rest on psychological and theological ignorance. In Our Need to Lament, aesthetic philosopher Calvin Serveld observes, biblical laments are intercessory prayers from people who are suffering, and they're trying to reconcile their experiences and their helplessness in a confusing world. It follows, then, that we should not necessarily be afraid to express our anger, our discontent to our higher power. In a 2023 Christianity Today essay, Keep Complaining About God, Just Don't Ignore Him, Drew Dyke essentially argues as much, stating, even our angriest accusations are preferable to indifference. Depending on who you ask, between 30 to 70% of the Psalms, the songbook of the Judeo-Christian tradition, are laments. Indeed, according to Christian doctrine, Jesus Christ quoted one of them when he was on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? The practice of lament has played a central role in my own personal experience in dealing with depression and grief. Over 3 years ago, my youngest son, August Robert Hubbard, died by suicide after a long battle with clinical depression. About 8 months after he passed away, I experienced what I can only describe as a vision for a book about my beautiful boy. This book eventually became Scenes with My Son. Almost by default, I fell upon my skills as a writer and artist to celebrate my son's beautiful life, to painfully question how a just God could allow this terrible event to occur, and, yes, to lament his passing. I'm going to conclude by updating my Waiting for Godot story. I'm a member of something called the American Theater Critics Association, and they have a conference in New York City every October. I had a chance to go this last October. Since we're theater critics, we go to conferences during the day, but they leave the evening wide open so we can go see shows. On the final night of the conference, which was a Saturday night, I hopped in a subway and crossed into Brooklyn to see a brand new production of Waiting for Godot at Theater for New Audiences. Unlike when I was 16 years old, this powerful performance did not point me towards the endless hope of the kingdom of Christ. Instead, Beckett's poetic masterpiece of existential despair pointed me towards existential despair. There were several things about the show that bothered me. One of the characters is suicidal, and he repeatedly makes jokey lines about killing himself. You can imagine I no longer found these lines in the least bit funny. But there's a secondary character called Pazzo who has a final speech that completely destroyed me. To give you a little context, Pazzo is a character who shows up in Act 1 full of bravado. But in Act 2, he shows up greatly diminished. He's mysteriously gone blind, and we don't know why. The two tramps repeatedly question him about how he lost his sight, and before he exits, he delivers the following furious speech, monologue. Have you not done tormenting me with your accursed time? It's abominable. When? One day, is that not enough for you? One day, he went dumb. One day, I went blind. One day, we'll all go deaf. One day, we were born. One day, we shall die. The same day, the same second. Is that not enough for you? They give birth astride the grave. The light gleams an instant, and it's night once more. In hindsight, my surprisingly bleak response to this bleak play should have been predictable compared to the version I witnessed when I was 16 years old. At age 55, I painfully understand how far away I now am from the beginning of my life. and how much closer I am to its end. The next morning was my final morning in New York City, and my plan was to go to my conference in the morning and then to wander around Manhattan in the afternoon until my flight left in the evening when I could fly back to Iowa. However, I didn't realize that the little boutique hotel I was staying at in Greenwich Village would not permit me to store my bags behind their front desk. So with their help, I found an alternative. I had to pay to have it stored someplace else. And by the time I did this, I realized that I would miss the beginning of my conference. So I found myself wandering around Greenwich Village like a tourist, which I was. And then I heard church bells ring out. It's Sunday morning. You know how it is when you travel and you don't even know what day it is? Well, with the help of my phone, I found my way to St. George's Episcopal Church in West Chelsea. That's my crumpled up church bulletin that was in my raincoat. Godot was still very much in my thoughts as I stumbled into the ornate church. It was completely packed. I had to sit in the very back row as the opening hymn was playing. For a time, I simply abided within the majestic poetry of the ancient liturgy. Then I actively listened to a powerful and highly intellectual sermon delivered by a guest pastor from Sweden, a Lutheran. And then I walked up to the communion rail, knelt, and I took the sacrament, the symbolic representation of death and resurrection. Watching the officiant then, I sat in my seat and watched the officiants bring the Holy Communion to a disabled man who couldn't walk up to the rail himself, who happened to be sitting in the pew right next to me. The surging joy of the post-communion hymn electrocuted me, and I discovered myself simultaneously giggling and weeping. Although a delayed response, the brilliant poetic existential angst of waiting for Godot once again played a central role, leading me to one of the more enriching, edifying, and moving experiences of my life. Pazzo's speech achieved new meaning for me that Sunday morning in Manhattan. Rather than a convincing argument proclaiming the meaninglessness of life and the inevitability of death, which it certainly is, Pazzo's artful monologue of suffering transformed into a powerful artistic prayer of lament. Once again, I find myself grateful and indebted for the gift of doubt and the practice of lament. Thank you.